Okay. Okay. I hear what you're saying. Oh, there we go. I hear what you're saying, good people of the world. I hear what you're saying. And you're right. You're right. It is 6:31. It is indeed 6:31. It's not 6:30. And I do have an excuse. I do have an excuse. My excuse is, and hear me out, last time you were here, you forgot to like the video. I know you didn't mean it. I know you didn't mean it. I know that it was happenstance because one thing led to another. And then by the time that you look down and you look back up, the video was gone. The like button was never pressed. You had every intention. If you press it now or within the first 10 minutes of watching, then then we can have a redo and I can come back tomorrow at 6:30 on the dot or before 6:30 even, maybe 6 o'clock. Who knows? Hey, everybody. Hopefully, you are doing super well out there. Please like the video and subscribe to the channels. Welcome back to the Inner Storyteller. It is the humblest of hosts, Soul Expression, and we are starting a new mini series in the podcast today because I have more reflective information, knowledge, if you will, to share with you, thoughts, ideas, conclusions, absolutes. No, I'm kidding. But today we're going into manufactured mentality. And the root of all manufactured mentality is solipsism. Okay, manufactured thought has a root, and it's called solipsism. Now, solipsism, by way of the inner storyteller, is how I look at it. Okay, it's always the stories that we're telling ourselves, the stories that we've bought and believe are true, that shape who we become. And, through stories told in a certain way, believed in a certain way, there happens to be this common thread that we're going to talk about today that shows up in both the order follower and order giver class and is just not the best thing. It's not the best thing ever. So please, give it up for our manufactured mentality series. Now, what do I mean by the phrase? A conditioned mind is a natural outcome of being a programmable being in an environment, right? We've talked about this on this channel. Every human being arrives to uh, the world is already in motion. Patterns are already established, patterns of behavior, patterns of social cues, patterns of speech, obviously, patterns of non-verbal communication. Um, the world is already in motion, and the new human beings, babies, receive stories about this place from both their environment and the people around them, most likely parents for most people. And they receive the stories before they can evaluate them, before they have any experience to evaluate the stories. And they form core beliefs based on the stories that are given to them by both, again, both the environment and the people around them. This is, the adults and the other children around them. That's conditioning. Conditioning is universal. There's nothing, let me, hold on, let me fix this right quick. There's nothing about conditioning that makes somebody weak or anything like that, right? Conditioning is universal. A manufactured mentality is a little more specific. It's what you get when the conditioning is deliberate and a means to an end. When the stories being installed in the mind of the population are being chosen and distributed by people, forces, if you will, who understand exactly what those stories will produce and how to benefit from the production. That's not a natural outcome of being a programmable being in nature, right? That's a designed outcome, a powerful designed outcome of being in an environment that was engineered by social engineers, by ancient orders of psychologists that have held the true facts about psychology behind closed doors. And the difference matters, right? Because it changes the diagnosis and it changes what the solution looks like. You don't treat a manufactured mentality the same way that you treat ordinary conditioning. You have to identify the factory. You have to identify the lab that concocted the stories with a manufactured mentality, right? And the factory in this case is aiming for one foundational idea, one philosophical position, one worldview that once installed in the mind, once the inner storyteller writes that into reality for that person, so to speak, it makes every other corruption of thinking available with justification. Once you have this story in your system, the rest will follow with some terrible logic. And that idea that I'm talking about is, of course, solipsism. Okay? The root of all manufactured thought. As you can see on the top right of this thumbnail, it says only your mind is certain to exist. Everything else is a maybe. When all frameworks are constructed, the only honest thing left is what you feel. And then at the bottom it says the liberation process can be hijacked. Let's get into that. Okay? Let's get into this baby. What solipsism actually is. Solipsism is the philosophical position that only your mind is certain to exist, and that because the entire world, as you experience it, is mediated through your consciousness, which is somewhat true, you cannot actually verify that anything outside of your personal consciousness is real in any way. Other people might be real, maybe. The physical world might be real. But you can't know. You can't know anything except for I am. That's all you can truly be certain of, that you are. You can't really be certain of what you are in solipsis, in this mindset. You can't really be certain of who you are or whose you are in this mindset. All you can be certain of is that you are. And anything that that suggests is speculative at best, subjective, right? That's the mindset, okay? Because only your mind is certain to exist, you can know nothing else besides your mind exists. And on the surface, that almost sounds like a sophisticated, right, epistemological observation of nature. And in a narrow academic sense, parts of it are hinting at something true. You cannot get a good lie without a little truth. You can't, right? A good lie is going to feature true things. In fact, some of the best lies that may be, a bit complicated feature a lot of truth. And there's like one tweak somewhere that creates the lie out of it and creates the danger in adopting said story as truth and like living by it. Regardless, in a very narrow sense, some of the things that were just explained as the solipsistic mindset have truth in them. You can find versions of some of these concepts in serious philosophers' work across history, right? Descartes, Berkeley, certain strains of Eastern non-dualism, um, Advaita, right? Which may get mistranslated into Western individualist contexts sometimes. But regardless, here is what solipsism becomes when it leaves the philosophy seminar and enters the actual operating system of the human being living a real life with real people around him or her. Okay? It becomes the conclusion that because only your mind is sure to exist, nothing outside of your experience can make a legitimate moral claim on you, which means moral accountability under the solipsistic mindset, mentality, if you will. Moral accountability becomes a human construct. Right and wrong becomes preference only, right? You hear atheists arguing this all the time. Right and wrong becomes preference only rather than natural law. And since no framework, you know, is binding by nature, since every moral system is just a story someone told, right? And you don't have to accept the story, right? You have freedom of choice as a human being. The only honest position left is to follow what gives you pleasure and avoid what causes you pain, right? It's a dangerous worldview, but that's the solipsistic. That's what they aim for when they push solipsism onto humanity through entertainment, media, etc., uh, uh, news. When they push uh, this worldview, what they're aiming at is that they want your subconscious mind to be occupied justifying your behaviors because, well, you don't really know at the end of the day if what you're doing is right or wrong. You can't really know because you're not God. All you know is you exist and you have these pains and pleasures, and you'd rather the pleasures. That's all you know. Right? It's a cop out. It's a cop out. And once that's running in the inner storyteller, every behavior that you could name becomes justifiable personally to that person. Every harm becomes available. And every other person in the world, at best, becomes a means to an end, and at worst, every other human being is an obstacle that you have to step on to get where you want to go. And here's something that I want to spend some more time on today because I think it's the most important and least discussed aspect of some of these topics, some of this philosophy. Solipsism does not primarily arrive in people through a philosophy textbook. It doesn't mainly come from someone sitting down and deciding to adopt a nihilistic worldview consciously, deliberately, on purpose, knowingly, and willingly. It arrives as a temptation. And specifically, and this is the part that most people in the like awakening and consciousness communities kind of don't want to hear, it arrives most powerfully in people who set out to do genuine inner work to learn the nature of the self. Here's why. When you start examining your your personal consciousness or what you experience as consciousness in general, when you start exploring and examining and quieting your inner thoughts and observing the reality of yourself, of your own being, which is never a sin, by the way, which cannot be converted into anything negative. When you are observing, becoming quiet, attempting to understand yourself by observing yourself with your own awareness or whatever. When you begin to see through the stories you were handed in your formative years, and you start to forgive certain things. When you recognize that the moral framework that you were given were installed before you could cognize a choice, right? But they were not chosen, right? They were programmed into you. When you start to realize these things, which again, there's nothing wrong with it, especially if they programmed good morals into you. That's part of being a human being is we are programmable by the people and the environment we're surrounded with, as well as once we're over a certain age, we program ourselves through our own choices. Right? What you do now, you'll do later. The way you do one thing, is how you do everything. Um, garbage in, garbage out. When you start examining your inner storyteller in a substantial way, two things happen. Okay. First thing, obviously, is that your mind begins to elevate. Your awareness expands and you see more of life itself. You see more subtleties and more of the otherwise unseen, and it gets hard to try and have conversations with certain people. Um, you know, your mind starts to expand and your frequency, your mental frequency, if you will, starts to elevate. You start seeing through layers of manufactured narrative that most people will never question, right? The sorting function, which we often talk about and bring up, which is a part of my philosophy in the inner storyteller. Make sure you click that link right here. um, and get the book. But regardless, the sorting function begins to be examined rather than just executed, and something real starts to come through. At the same time, I told you there's two things that happen. At the same time, the flesh is still running the old programming. Listen, right? The flesh, the body, hasn't been trained under the guise of this new expanded mind. The dopamine pathways are still there. The addiction architecture is still there, operating the way that it always has. The survival instincts, the fear responses, the deep psychological conditioning from trauma, the deep psychological conditioning from decades of mundane. All of that is still running, right? And it's running on the hardware. As the software updates, the hardware has its, you have to take time with it. And in that gap between the elevated mind and the still conditioned flesh, solipsism arrives from within as a very seductive resolution. Because what it offers, it says, you now know that all of the moral teachings, all of the frameworks, all of the, all of the moral rules that you were given were installed by people and not chosen by yourself, right? People with interests in your compliance with this moral code that they gave you. You now know that the conventional story about right and wrong was handed to you before you could choose it. So, who's to say that that's actually true? Who's to say that there even is such a thing as right or wrong? If all frameworks are constructed, right? Let's pull the picture back up. If all frameworks are constructed, then no framework is obligatory. And the only honest thing left to follow is how I feel, what I want, what the body is telling me that I want. I have to listen to my body. So the elevation gets used to justify a descent. The expanded awareness becomes a permission to stop caring about what that reality does to other people. The freedom from manufactured frameworks becomes freedom from all accountability to that person personally in their lives. And the person slipping into this usually does not recognize it with a label like solipsism. It feels to them like clarity. It feels to them like finally being honest after years of pretending. And it feels to them like a logical conclusion of seeing through the lies. You know, I'm a huge fan and will always be grateful for the work of Mark Passio. Mark Passio, he's from Philly, I believe he's from Philly. Um, you know, he's a teacher of natural law. Um, I think that's the most concise way to put it. I mean, he's a presenter. He's a former musician. He's um, he runs seminars. Like he brings people together. and he's the creator of the One Great Work Network, um, as well as the phenomenal podcast, What on Earth is Happening, and the phenomenal website, whatonearthishappening.com. He's a whole lot of stuff, right? But all in all, he's a teacher of natural law. And Mark Passio's work on this, on solipsism, is definitely worth naming directly because he identified something very precise that most critics of this philosophy miss. Solipsism is not just a philosophical error that people arrive at accidentally. Right? Solipsism and mentalities that can be kind of boxed in and named like that in general, but definitely solipsism is a tool. It can be used as a tool. Your mentality can be a tool because it creates vulnerabilities when it creates patterns of behavior. It is deliberately distributed through the very systems of knowledge that are supposed to produce liberation. Now, the occult sciences, the you know traditions that explore consciousness in occult ways. Occult means hidden, in hidden ways, as well as the awakening philosophies that are and have always been public. All of them carry the solipsism temptation inside of them. This is why I call solipsism the root of all manufactured thought. They all carry that opportunity inside of them because they all begin by dismantling the external moral frameworks that were keeping the person inside the conventional story. It's like, you grow up and you're told there's a sky daddy, and I'm not being crass with like Christians, Muslims, or people that follow Judaism. But like there's this daddy in the sky. There's this dad father figure in the sky. Sky daddy, if you will. And Sky Daddy said, "This is what morality is." And then, he divvied out these punishments for a while for being immoral, and then he stopped, and then, now mostly you kind of reap what you sow to a degree, but your punishment actually comes by way of you either get into eternal goodness or you get into eternal badness in one of two ways, hell or purgatory, right? So you grow up with that story. And I'm not talking about your super biblical scholar or your super Quran scholar or anything like that. So, somebody that studies all of the lore and has all of the grammar. I'm not talking about those unique individuals. I'm talking about your average person. You grow up and you're told, hey, there's a sky daddy, and the sky daddy said, this is what morality is. And when we break it, sky daddy gets really mad. But also, we can't really do any tests. We can't bring you into a direct relationship with them. You have to do that yourself. So, we don't really, it's called a faith system, right? You have faith in it, and maybe, one day you can awaken into a living relationship with it. But before you have one, you don't have any context for it except people told you. People told you what to do, people told you what to say and what to think, right? Again, which is normal, which is a part of being super young to a degree. Right? The best teachers, of course, let you arrive at the thing yourself, but they also are kind of guiding you in a certain way because they have the knowledge and they have been here, you know? So you're told all your life, somebody up there watching you all the time. He's very jealous and very sad all the time. And sorry. And he's either going to punish you forever or he's going to give you the forever goodness. And other than that, Like what you do on Earth, you kind of just, you figure it out. Some people are blessed individually, most people are not, right? With like big things, right? And you kind of decide one day, yeah, I've had enough of that story. That story's not for me anymore. I'm going to do search, try to find, try to discover, try to awaken to a different story, to a story that more so aligns with maybe their lived experience or something, you know? Or maybe they're just being rebellious and they're like, I'm deciding to explore other things and I want to see what's out there. And they stumble across some sort of body of work that may or may not be called, a part of what we call the occult, because there are so many bodies of work out there that are not the big three traditions, um, that are not hidden, right? They're not occult traditions. And then there's a lot of occult traditions, and there's a lot of denominations of the big three. But regardless, you switch out of the Sky Daddy story and you get into something more so aligned with nature, more so aligned with things that you can test and you can explore and get results and learn something, right? Observe, um, and you start moving from faith system to something more so like a knowledge system, or you aim for knowing, and somewhere between gaining real spiritual knowledge and leaving religion, there's this limbo where you haven't learned enough to say that you got it, and you're learning so much that you're like a completely different person in some ways. And in that limbo, it is very tempting to feel like it's taking too long to get to spiritual awakening. And so, what happens with a lot of people is they try and bypass taking the time to train their body to be as aligned with awakening as their mind is becoming, and dismiss morality altogether, because they sort of had it with being lied to and not being able to test, and people are super annoyed when they come with real questions regarding what they're told and they don't have the answers, and they don't like the chat gbt prepared answers that come from people that just love to collect talking points. They want to talk with somebody that actually can understand where they're coming from and get real answers from them, and there's nobody around necessarily for a lot of people. And then they get into the occult, or they get into just natural law, or they get into a different tradition, that's just, let's just say, like a Eastern tradition, something less Sky Daddy, right? Is the comparison that I'm using here. And there's this moment, there's just this, and it's not just one day. There's like a long moment where you still not there yet, and you've been wanting to speed this process up and just reach awakening. And so there's something that becomes tempting about throwing away morality, because when you throw away morality, you have arrived at awakening. It's just not real, but you can delude yourself into thinking, I figured it out. Nothing is wrong, because nothing is right, because we don't know anything for real. It's all an illusion. I've made it. Now I made it, right? But your body is still running on the old addiction based programming, fight, flight, freeze programming. And, and yet, you do have more of a grasp of how certain things do work, how certain things are, you know, like constructed in the universe. It's a very, very sloppy word, but I couldn't think of a better one. So, The dismantling of the old stories is, of course, necessary and legitimate. The conventional story you know, does need to be examined. And the moral frameworks that were installed rather than chosen do need to be at least questioned if you're going to evolve, right? That part of the work is fine and it's real and it produces good results. But dismantling your belief system creates a window. You have to be very careful around that window. A moment of genuine openness where the old framework is being removed and the new foundation has not really been established yet because you just don't know enough yet. You haven't spent enough time in the seat. And in that window, if the right story arrives, the story that says, since all frameworks are constructed, none of them actually bind you morally, your liberation may get hijacked. And the person who was doing genuine awakening work suddenly finds themselves with philosophical permission to follow their flesh wherever it leads. And it goes to dark places. You cannot follow the flesh. You suddenly have permission to get a little more real about it, to treat other people's experiences as less real than yours, as less of a percentage of reality than yours. You have permission suddenly to conclude that since morality is a construct by people, hedonism is a legitimate behavioral guide. And of course, the dark occult order giver class that has been constructing, concocting, and distributing these philosophies and the symbols that are produced in these philosophies throughout our entertainment and literature and movies, all of these things. The dark occult understand this mechanism of the mind because they are a bunch of psychologists, right? They understand that the most effective way to neutralize a genuinely awakened population is not to prevent the awakening necessarily, but to redirect where it's headed from the middle of it, right? To get you at the right time and make you go the wrong way. To get you at the right time to make you go the wrong way. A population of genuinely awakened people aligned with natural law is ungovernable. Oops. Is ungovernable, right? A population of people who have awakened just enough to reject conventional stories, but not enough to discover the deeper moral structure operative in this universe. That population is actually slightly more controllable than a population that never really woke up at all and is just following orders because it rejected what it grew up with and replaced it with justification for hedonism, right? And egoism, which produces exactly the behaviors that serve the order giver class's interests, right? They want to make us chaotic. They want to make us always fighting different factions of each other, keep our eyes off of them, keep our minds off of the question, why do we have a government if that's what the government's going to be, right? Why do we have one? We don't need it. We can put it down at any time together, not individually, or not individually successfully. um, Here's the fork in the road. Okay. Here is the fork in the road that every person doing genuine inner work eventually reaches. The mind has begun to see through the constructed nature of conventional stories installed in them before they could question them. The old frameworks start coming apart. You feel like you're going crazy sometimes. And the awareness is expanding. And two different directions are available. The first direction says, now I can choose more consciously. Pardon me. Now I can align with what is actually true rather than what was just installed by other people. The fact that the conventional moral framework that I'm used to was constructed does not mean that morality itself is a construct. It means that I was given a map drawn by people with interests in where I ended up. And now I can look at the territory directly, which does include morality. And now I can trace the actual laws, the ones that operate whether I believe in them or not, right? The ones that produce consequences that are proportional to the moral weight of my choices, regardless of whether any human institution ever enforces them. And I can align myself with those rather than whatever was installed before. That's one direction. That direction leads toward a study and implementation of natural law, toward lived love. Love, not only as a feeling, but when they say like love as a verb, active and often costly, consistent orientation toward the well being and service of others and the shared human objective to experience more freedom in this life and on this earth with each other, right? And freedom for all, not just freedom for I. Toward more accountability as our awareness grows, right? Toward more willingness to bear the cost of right action when it's inconvenient. Now, obviously, the second direction, pardon me, says that now that I know that I know nothing, and because I can know nothing, nothing is actually binding on my behavior. The liberation from the constructed moral framework that my parents gave me is also a liberation from all frameworks whatsoever. The awareness that the conventional moral rules were given to me and not chosen becomes or it is converted into a conclusion, okay, that there is nothing objective about morality in this world. And the only honest position left is maximum self interest. Both directions come from the same starting point, which is an awakening out of the conventional story. They both begin with a genuine recognition that what was given to them was not chosen by them and was not given to them by people that know factually what they're talking about. The difference between the two is entirely in what the person does next with that recognition. And of course, you study past choices to know them by their fruits. If you need remove the weeds, you must tug upon their roots. Solipsism is the root of manufactured thought in this way. From the outside, the fruit test is the only reliable way to distinguish between which two directions a person is going in. Not the philosophy that someone claims to hold, and not how much they know about consciousness or can speak about natural law or the dark occult or statism versus anarchy or anything. But what their actions actually produce in the living world. Whether the people around them are better off or worse off for their presence. Whether the actual consequences of their actual choices over actual time are moving toward flourishing or away from it. And from the inside, for anyone reflecting on their own lives honestly, the indicator is simpler and more immediate, of course. It is love increasing or decreasing as my awareness grows? Love as a verb, not the feeling of happiness only, not the feeling of euphoria, not relaxation, okay, but the verb love. Is that increasing or decreasing as my awareness expands? The active choosing of another person's well being, even when it costs something other than myself. The consistent orientation towards care and truth rather than going along to get along and consumption. The willingness to be accountable to something larger than one's self or one's immediate desires. That kind of love, right? Genuine awakening produces more of that. We get more care, not less. More accountability, not less. Right? Solipsism produces the opposite and calls it freedom. But that's not freedom. That's a cop out. It's morally dangerous. That's the flesh winning the argument against the mind that was supposed to be expanding beyond the flesh. The mind that is genuinely elevating does not give the flesh that permission. It finds what's underneath the conventional story, the conventional moral frameworks that we get, and connects the through lines, connects the overlap, right? That's what the real awakened mind does, is it gets down to the business of acting on behalf of others with the knowledge of what others' problems are at their root. Right? The more actually awakened you are, the more clearly you understand the root of the problems we face in humanity. That is a universal truth. Because you know, when you target the root, you target something that could possibly lead to permanent change. I'm using permanent a little loosely there, but lasting change. Okay? And that's the work. Not the comfortable version, not the version that keeps finding new costs to bear for no reason. Um, you know. And anyway, before I leave you today, there's one more thing that we got to get into that I said solipsism justifies behaviors. Solipsism as a mentality, not necessarily a religion in and of itself. It's more so a mentality. And in my opinion, solipsism is the root of all manufactured mentalities. What are we collectively justifying every day, no matter how bad it gets? One may answer the government. Every day we justify their existence, their continued abuse, and continued function, right? The government officials go to work, the people that are tasked with obeying their orders, obey their orders, all of that, right? So before I leave you, I want to plant one more seed, and it's one that's going to come back a bunch of times in this series. At what point does a gang become a government? Think about a gang, at what point does a gang become a government? And what does that conversion into a government from a gang actually change about the moral evaluation of its members' actions? Hmm? Think about that. Seriously. Think about a gang. A gang is a group of individuals who decided collectively that their desire for resources, territory, and power justifies the use of force they're willing to employ against people who have not consented to their use of force. A gang writes its own rules. They enforce those rules with violence or the credible threat of violence. They extract tribute from the people in their territory, and they punish anyone who refuses to comply or who questions their authority. That's what a gang does. A government, on the other hand, is a group of people who have decided collectively that their desire for resources, territory, and power justifies the use of force against people who haven't consented to that force. Also, on the other hand, they write their own rules. Also, on the other hand, they enforce their rules through the violence and or credible threat of violence that gangs use. Also, on the other hand, they extract tribute or taxes from people in their territory in the form, and they punish anyone who refuses to comply or who questions their authority. But that's on the other hand, because that's when a government does it. Obviously, the operation is identical, but the difference is the story attached to the label or symbol of their name. The government has a founding document, it has a flag, it has a history taught in schools that frames its violence as either legitimate or justifiable, and its extraction as necessary for its survival. It has a mythology of consent, the social construct, right? The democratic process. Choose your winner. Choose your champion. And gangs don't have all of that, and they definitely don't have the media that a government has. But here's the connection. Here's the solipsism connection. The government member who carries out an order that harms innocent people, the soldier, the tax collector, uh, the police officer, you know, that government official is making the same moral calculation as the gang member who does the same thing under a different brand, getting orders from a different boss in a different uniform or costume. Both are using the institution's authority as a substitute for their own conscience, for their own accountability to the actions they are themselves taking in the physical world. Both are outsourcing the moral evaluation of their actions to a structure, an institution, an organization, rather than performing the evaluation of the moral weight of their actions themselves and getting better at making the right choice. Both are, in the most precise sense, practicing a form of solipsism. They are treating their own desire for survival, income, a sense of belonging, and approval within the institution or organization as the only worthy moral consideration of their actions. I was just doing my job. I was just out with the homies. This is just what we do. And approval within the institution as the only real moral consideration, and treating the suffering of people on the receiving end of their actions as less real, less morally binding, and less worth accounting for than their own feelings. Obviously, the costume does not change the moral weight of the action. The founding document doesn't change the moral weight of the action. The democratic process does not authorize things that are immoral in nature. And natural law does not care about the branding. It only cares about what was done to whom and whether it was initiated against someone who hadn't violated anyone's rights or not. The gang member and the government official are both running the same manufactured mentality, which is the belief that the institution, the membership, transfers moral authority from the natural law standard to the institution's standard. You know, a funny thing about this also is usually when you're dealing with a federal employee, if you want to um, go after their pocket in a court of law, you can't. You have to sue the place they work for, right? I recently, I just settled uh, in a case against an institution that is a government institution. Um, I got a little change, but I didn't get as much as I wanted. But anyway, uh, um, and I couldn't sue the part that caused me financial damages. I had to sue a specific office, a specific title, and it's like that's so dumb, right? Why can't I bring the person to court that did me wrong? The person that signed the contract and didn't follow up and make sure that their team did what they were supposed to do. Why can't I sue that guy? Why do I have to go about it this other way? And it's the same thing. The institutional membership transfers the moral authority for when wrong actions are taken, and accountability, it's accountability time, right? Because the institution says it's legitimate, the conscience can be put aside. Now that's not liberation, good people. That's just solipsism with a costume. And we're going to examine all of the costumes. Okay? We're going to take real examination of the costumes. Now, I like to talk about a whole lot on this channel. And what's coming in this manufactured mentality series? First of all, it's probably going to be a very long series. Okay? So it's going to be a huge playlist one day. But solipsism is where we start because, again, right now, I consider solipsism as like the root of manufactured mentality. Okay, every other manufactured mentality we're going to examine is like downstream of the mindset that, I don't really know, therefore I can abdicate accountability elsewhere because I can't really know right from wrong. Okay? I can't really know anything, including right from wrong. Therefore, I don't even know if y'all really exist. I don't even know if this is real. Therefore, my actions are justified. Um, that is like the foundation, right? The foundational error that the rest of the manufactured mentalities that we're going to discuss on in this playlist are building off of. And the gang in the government question that we just planted is also going to grow into its own sort of dedicated treatment. We're going to talk about moral relativism. We're going to talk about scientism, okay, which is not science. Okay, scientism is like rigid skepticism. It keeps you from exploring and letting the truth lead the way, just like any other religion does. The inversion of natural law. We're going to study that. We're going to look into that. The specific ways that manufactured mentalities express themselves in culture, institutions, individual lives. But we have to start here because, again, you study past choices, you shall know them by their fruits. If you need remove the weeds, you must tug upon their roots. If you don't know, if you're not a gardener, when you're dealing with getting weeds out of your garden, if you just pop the heads off or you just, pull at the stem and, kind of kill them by taking a lot up and you just leave the bottom there and you think the bottom is just going to die, it's going to grow right back, right? When you really want to remove the weeds, you have to get all the way down and remove them by tugging at their roots. You have to get the roots out of the ground. So we start here because you can't uproot what you haven't identified as root. And you can't identify it accurately till you understand where it comes from. Not from outside through a book or a teacher, but from inside in the gap between a mind that is starting to see and a flesh that has not finished being retrained, so to speak. And I mean by yourself. And that gap is real. And the temptation to fall into solipsism is very real, and it doesn't belong to any religion. Solipsism is a mindset. It's a mentality. It can you can call yourself any label as far as following a faith system and be a solipsist. Love, on the other hand, is a verb. Love is chosen. Love is often costly, inconvenient, and when it's a verb, it's consistent. Do you want to live a story of solipsism? Do you want to live a story of love? What story are you willing to live? Let me know in the comments, good people. Thank you so very much for hanging out. Um, and I will see you tomorrow in the next one. Peace and love, always and always.